hybrid format. In this hybrid format, both in presence, someone is here in the audience, and we are here together with Henning and Marc, and other people online. We have an incredibly rich agenda, as you have seen, 38 speakers from 16 different countries, spread across 8 sessions today and tomorrow. With all of you, we will be discussing different key questions, from the disruption of the supply chain and global trade to the social impact of COVID-19, from the European integration perspective to the impact of sustainability in transportation, in energy, and with a focus on the Mediterranean region. We will also be looking at the management of global common and innovation in money. As in the tradition of dialogue of continents, this must be a useful opportunity to frankly debate on how and in which direction, I think this is more important again, in which direction the global economy is moving. With this aim, we finalize the program, and the high-level panelists represent a guarantee for the quality of the debate. We also expect a wide public audience for our session in live streaming on our YouTube channels. This meeting today has been possible thanks to the support of Compagnia di Sanpaolo and the partnership between SRM, which is the research center part of Intesa Sanpaolo banking group I'm managing, together with Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee and the Center for European Policy Network. To this regard, let me give a special warm welcome here in Naples to Marc Uzan and to Henning Vöpel. Without their support and their strong commitment, this meeting would not have been possible. One final remark. Unfortunately, we are experiencing a rebound in the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has been impossible to organize the full meeting in presence. But I really think that no technology, I think you agree on that point, no technology can be a surrogate for people to meet face to face. And thanks to that science, we must look with positive eyes. We must look with positive eyes to the near future. With a promise, the new edition of Dialogue of Continents, Marc, will be held in presence. So, Marc, thank you again for your incredible work, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you online and also face-to-face to this 4th edition of Dialogue of Continents. It's a great pleasure for us to be in Naples. I want to thank you, Massimo, and your team, and also your bank for providing support for hosting this event that we are co-hosting with our partners, Henning, Vöpel, and the new Center for European Policy Network. And more than that, I think we are coming here at a time where, unfortunately, we are still facing major challenge for the global economy. And when we started to put together this program, we felt that, well, by November, we were hoping that COVID-19 will be something behind us, that we are going to talk about the post-COVID environment, and that we are going to build back better. But unfortunately, the situation is as it is. We are facing a new wave here in Europe, but also all over the world. But we all know that the only one instrument for economic policy that will work today for the global world is vaccination for all of us. So despite the major challenge, and the title of this Dialogue of Continent edition is all about the unevenness of the global economy, meaning that indeed we are going to be in a world that is going to be very divergent. Divergence in terms of recovery and expansion, divergence about access to vaccine, and we can clearly see, the divergence at, emerging market will face a more bleak futures, because before for them to reach back their GDP growth for what they left will take, more years than the advanced countries. So a major challenge in front of us in terms of the way the global economy will be operating. We don't know yet what will be happening in terms of monetary policy, as we clearly see now the concerns that we have all over the world with inflation. Emerging markets are already tackling monetary policy, and we see now major concern in the US and in Europe to do the same. the question, and I think would be very interesting to understand what is behind that. And I think this first session that Massimo will be sharing on supply chain disruptions will give us maybe a more practical, angle to discuss what is happening in terms of supply chain. And, the famous dictum about, just in time might be replaced by just in case. So there might be the new normal for the global economy. But more than that, moving from the unevenness of the global economy, I think the big discussion we will have today will be, in fact, are we going to be under the same underpinning of globalization, or are we going to shift to a new type of globalization, modify, or something different? This is going to be a very interesting panel that will be discussed today. And tomorrow, of course, we will be looking at the concept of connectivity. We are in Naples, so this is very important to try to understand that we are going to a world that is going to be more fragmented, more segmented, more contested, but at the same time, more connected. So it's going to be very good to look and to listen to former politicians, policymakers who will try to understand what will be the new dynamic among European and Mediterranean countries. Last but not least, we understand with the pandemic, the concept of building back better. We need to green the financial system. We need to green the global economy. We need to embrace the zero net global economy. But in order to do that, we need more resilience and we need more global comment. And I think the high-level panel tomorrow on this topic will be also very important. It will be, so the number of speakers will be there, particularly the chairman of this very interesting working group that was presented as a G7 on global resilience and global comment. So a very rich agenda. I think for some of you who are here in presence, thank you very much for your participation, but also for the whole audience who will be joining us over the next 2 days. I want to thank again our partners, Henning, Massimo. I think it's a great honor for us to be in Naples. I totally agree, Massimo. Next year, whatever it takes, it will be face-to-face for all of us. And I look forward for great discussions. And I'm pleased to give now the floor to Henning. Henning, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marc, and good morning and welcome to this conference also from my side. My name is Henning Vöpel. I'm director of the Center for European Policy, and we are based in not only in Germany, but also in France and Italy. So we have a more European perspective on the global economy. And first of all, Marc, I would like to thank you that we can jointly host and participating in this great conference. And many thanks to you for having organized and bringing up again a great panel, a great conference. And of course, thank you, Massimo, for the kind invitation to come to Naples and the great hospitality you have offered to us. So that's what we really appreciate. And so that's what both of you said. I think in terms of or with regard to the agenda, to the topics, I mean, it is more than obvious that these years, this time is defining a very decisive moment, not only recovering from the crisis, but also laying the foundation for a better future. So, I mean, we are discussing many global challenges like climate change. We have to cope with that. We have to create a human-centric way to organize, to deal with digitization. We have many global crises we have to deal with. So we need to build on trust, on cooperation. And maybe you can report from yesterday. Yesterday, the new German government has presented the new agenda and was entitled with Dare More Progress. So we need more progress. And we all feel that there's a lot of optimism in politics, in understanding politics, and that we all feel that we can create a decisive moment, that we can make a difference. And I think seeing that is a reason to be optimistic. So I wish all of us 2 great and inspiring days in this conference. And again, thanks again, Marc and Massimo, for bringing up this conference. And yeah, so warm welcome again to all of you to joining us for an important conference. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to you. Great. So I think that perfectly in time we can start with the first session. So I ask Ekaterina, which is with us, to join, and you please to take the first row of floor. And just a few minutes we can start. So we now move to the first session, which is on the supply chain and the global trade disruption. We have 1 hour time to debate this key topic with 4 high-level speakers. One of them is here with us in Naples, Ekaterina Kozyreva, president of the IEC International, and 3 are joining us online. So please tell me if our guests are connected. Graham Slack, Chief Economist and the Head of Strategic Intelligence at the Møller-Maersk. Emily Rees, Senior Fellow at the European Center for International Political Economy. And Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, President of the Italian Institute for International Affairs, former Italian ambassador to the European Union and former European Commissioner. SRM, as I told you, is the research study of Intesa Sanpaolo banking group I'm managing, has a strong background in global logistics and transportation and trade analysis. And I would like to introduce this conversation by showing 2 slides, simply 2 slides that we have prepared to summarize 6 phenomena which are currently reshaping the global trade and some possible way forward. The point is that there's, I think, that we must see these phenomena in a dynamic way, not in a static way. And we can't predict anything because it's so complicated, the world economy right now, so we can't predict what will happen, but I think that there are clear signs of some changes. Let's check together these 6 points. The first point, we come from a period, the last 20 years, of free global trade, unrestrained global trade exchanges. One world, one global economy, producing in China or in Asia, and then moving to Europe, then selling in the United States or the contrary. I mean, we are moving, it seems, to a world with more custom duty, barriers, intra-area movements, that means regional globalization rather than really a world globalization, and so on. The second point, we come from a period in which the companies were organized under, most of them, at least the biggest, the lean production model. And the just-in-time was the based production based on timeless of delivery. You need something, you don't need to stock nothing. You call, and in 24 hours, there's the delivery of what you need. And we are moving toward a world with stocks, more where the stocks are needed. Think about what is happening in the automotive sector, no? Stockpiling to avoid the shortage of components. Automotive sector now is a sector in which, you know, the microchip is very rare, it's difficult. So this is a point. Third point, long global value chain. So world global value chain, you purchase raw materials, production, the distribution. I mean, every decision from the company point of view was based on price orientation. Now there is a process of shortening the global value chain and with a more regional chains. I mean, the point is to minimize the risk of and gain more control of the entire chain for being closer to the client, but also to activate circular economic process. You know, we are talking about sustainability. We are talking about circular economy as a model. We should also think about that circular economy is a shorter circle rather than a global circle. No? And this is something which is also pushing to the regionalization. Then for the following, the last 3 points. We come from a period of offshoring and delocalization, where the choice was, from the company point of view, to open a branch, to open a factory where there was the best price for land, or I mean for labor, for everything. The price and the cost was the base of the decision. Now there is the process of reshoring, or better, near-shoring. That means the return back of some production close to the manufacturing countries. And for Europe, that means also the near-shoring in the Mediterranean area. We come from a period of stable prices and low inflation. And we know we are moving. Let's see what happened in the United States or in Europe. Inflation now is a key word, which was not the case just 2 years ago or 1 year ago. With surge in price for raw materials, for energy, and so on. And we come, the last point, from a period which are decades and decades of an energy mix based on fossils, coal, oil, and gas here, and we are moving toward a new energy mix, which is in a certain way determined by environmental sustainability objective and carbon neutrality objective. That means a new triangle of energy, gas, renewables, and hydrogen. Well, these 6 points will help us to discuss the key question that in my mind is very clear. And this is the question I would like also the panelists will reply. Are these evolution temporary due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and so will the globalization restart soon? Or on the contrary, are these signs of structural changes in the world economy and in the global trade? So temporary or structural changes? No better person than Mr. Slack. I hope he's online. So please tell me if
yes.
Slack is online and if he can come on the screen. I hope so. And in any case, I think no better person to start with, because Mr. Slack is the chief economist of one of the most important global logistic players in the world. He has held several key positions in the past, from Bank of England to the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He has a lot of experience. And I think his view is very important to understand what is happening to the global trade and to the supply chain. So tell me, please, something if Mr. Slack is online. Is online?
Yes, Massimo, I can hear you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
We can hear you, so this is great. We can't see your face right now, but it will come, I think, in few minutes, but you can start in any case, if you heard me.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you clearly. Just one question. Can you see the slides I'm showing?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Excellent. Then let's kick off. Massimo, thank you very much for the kind word of introduction.
Can you pull, sorry, can you pull the slides in full screen?
They should now be in full screen.
In full screen, in order to better see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think this is what I can do from the controls made available to me.
It's good.
Yes, you must switch the screen if it's possible. No. Okay, stay in that way.
Yeah, it's good.
Stay in that way and you can start.
Excellent.
Please, you can start. We can hear you.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, good morning, everybody. And again, thanks, Massimo, for the
sorry, but in the previous version, not that one, because it's so small. The one you had, close this screen, please. Okay, stay in that way. You can start, please.
Okay, good. So what I want to do is just walk you through what we are seeing as a global shipping company in the ocean side of the business, and then talk a little bit around what the causes are to help, I think, frame some of the responses, Massimo, to your 6 questions, because I think, as always, the devil is in the details here. So the best single way I can capture for you what is going on and what disruption looks like is the slide I'm showing you here, which shows you the freight rates, the rate charged for carrying a single box, a 40-foot box, from Shanghai to these various locations. The green line shows you the rates today. The other lines show you rates for similar months in previous years. And as you can see here in the top left, the overall cost of transporting a box is 4 to 5 times higher than what is normally experienced. So a massive price increase for moving a box, and that's cascaded across the entire supply chain, including inland. And this is really the result of, if you like, a perfect storm of both demand and supply factors. And I think the demand side here is often forgotten about, so it's important that we just understand what's going on here. As you can see in this slide, the demand rebound, the blue line in the left-hand chart, has been quite extraordinary. We had trade growth of around 20% globally in Q2. There were some base effects there, but I'll show you in a minute. It was still very strong in level terms. And this is really important to understand. This rebound is 4 times as fast as the rebound we saw after the financial crisis. So to put that in context, we basically within 1 quarter had recovered the previous level of trade, 2019 level. That took 4 quarters after the financial crisis. And the level of trade that we had after 2 quarters was only achieved after the financial crisis after 2 years. So the size of the demand rebound has been absolutely extraordinary. Where has that demand come from? Well, if we look at the goods side and try and understand which sectors and verticals have driven this, you see on the right-hand side here that it's really been driven by 2 verticals, technology and retail. And this is driven by work from home. Technology, because we all need more devices, and retail largely driven by home appliances. So really 2 very strong work from home connected verticals that have driven this rebound. If we then look at this by region and look at it in levels, there's a number of key things to observe here. The first is in the top left, globally, the industry, the logistics industry, is moving more volumes than ever before. So despite all of these challenges, and they're very real and quite binding, despite all of that, the logistics industry, the global logistics industry, is moving more volumes than ever before. The second thing to notice here is that the panel called NAM, North America, please take note of the scales. They're much larger than the other scales. But here the rebound has been extremely strong, and not just the rebound, the persistence of that rebound has also been very, very strong. The third thing to notice is that rebound is now broadening across all regions, with most now back to or above trend growth. So again, a very, very strong rebound, initially led by the US, but broadening across regions. Then if we start turning to the supply side of the industry, but before doing that, just to underscore how strong demand is, and I mentioned it was led by the US, the first chart here on the left-hand side shows you US consumer goods demand. This is levels, it's in US dollar billions, real numbers, and the dotted line shows you the business as usual trend. And you can see here the tremendous overconsumption, if you will, that is being experienced by the US. All of the consumption above trend up until the end of 2020 was basically making up for the lost consumption during the crisis early in 2020. Everything after that is overconsumption, and this is what's really driven the supply chain crunch in the US. When we look then and double click on the supply side of the logistics industry, we need to do this in two steps. If we look at the ocean side, the ships sailing from port to port, the chart here shows you that every single vessel available is sailing. So this idling number of vessels that are not active is extremely low, 0.9% of the global trade, global fleet. The only vessels that are not sailing are either Iranian flagged or in for maintenance. So every single vessel, every vessel that has an engine and can float is on the water. The problem is that when they get to port, because of the congestion, the effective capacity that's offered is being impacted negatively by around 10 to 20%. Now, then the question is, so what's causing these port congestions and the very visible numbers you see of container ships waiting outside of LA and Long Beach, for instance, where there's anywhere up to 80 ships waiting at any one time? And the answer here is complex. It's a complex chain of intertwined elements that is causing the disruption. There are many elements to it. I just want to mention some of the key ones. The first, as I mentioned, is that ships are waiting outside of the ports. How much is that impacting? Well, if you have around 70 to 80 ships outside of LA and Long Beach, that's approaching 1 million containers. That's a lot of volume that's tied up outside of ports. The other element is that vessels are now running off schedule, so they normally run a very nice clockwork and evenly spaced timescale. That is being disrupted by the disruptions at origin in Yanshan and Ningbo earlier a few months ago. So this leads to a bunching of ships so that when they arrive at the origin in LA and Long Beach, for instance, it's very difficult to process that bunching of ships. The other element is that in the terminals itself, they have what's called yard space where all the boxes are stored. And the problem here is that that yard space is becoming very densely populated with boxes, meaning there's very little room to move and reducing efficiency of the ports. And it's challenging to evacuate all the containers from the port because inland ports, inland depots as they're called, are also full and overflowing. So this creates a backup all the way along the chain. The other key element here is warehousing. The way in which goods demand has been able to boom in the way it has is because of e-commerce. If we had not had that, the stimulus that had been applied would not have worked in the way it has and shown itself in goods demand. But the challenge is that the warehousing system is not built for this level of e-commerce penetration. Why is that important? It's because what e-tailers and retailers are doing is using the container boxes as overflow storage because the warehousing capacity is not sufficient. That takes many of these boxes out of circulation, which are needed to move goods back out of Asia. Again, another constraint on the system. And as we look forward, and as you talk about kind of the outlook, I think what's important is to note and underscore the COVID point that was made earlier. This is, of course, a key disruptor for supply chains. We expect there's a potential disruptions coming on the US West Coast with labor disputes. And of course, we're entering the winter season, which can also add further pressure on the logistics system, especially when it's as stressed as it is at the moment. The final point here is that when these congestions ease, which they will at some point, it will take time to reset the network. It's like resetting a watch. It takes time and it takes careful work to make sure that the entire system is reset so that it can once again work efficiently and smoothly. Finally, I just want to spend just 30 seconds on forward looking. And as you were hinting at, Massimo, there is a lot of rethinking going on around supply chains and what is the way forward. I think one of the things that many of our customers, all of our customers realized is if you don't have a resilient supply chain, you don't have a business. If you can't get goods to the customer's hands, you don't have a value proposition. So there's a real sort of expansion of the thinking about the importance of supply chains, number one, and secondly, how can you make them more resilient and as an essential part of the value proposition. The old way of doing things probably isn't the way forward, because that essentially, as you're also hinting at, involves either increasing inventory or rejigging your physical supply chain. Both of these are expensive, and therefore the question comes, can you do this at an attractive price point? So where customers are going is really 4 elements. They're seeking visibility and actionability. This means digitization, but also linking that to physical assets. So they have much more transparency and are able to respond in their supply chains in a much more resilient way. Secondly, strategic partnerships, long-term contingency planning, and really working with one partner rather than 10, 20, 30, 40 different partners, which adds fragility to the supply chain. The third element is flexibility, working with partners that can give them geographic and mode optionality, so that if they do multi-sourcing, which is expensive, you can do it at a more attractive price point. And finally, it's all about simplification. The supply chain is complex by nature, but because of the nature of the industry, which is in many ways old in the way it works, there's a lot of what we call undue complexity. That needs to be simplified and taken out, which is again enabling multi-sourcing and multi-production. So there's a lot of thinking going on under the hood, if you will, in the mechanics of the supply chain to make it more resilient. And in some cases, yes, there's thoughts about nearshoring and reshoring, but quite frankly, there are many obstacles to that, which we can discuss after the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your insight view. I think very, very interesting. We must remember that 90% of the world economy or the world trade is moving by shipping. So shipping industry is a key sector for world trade. We now move to Miss Emily Rees. I think she's connected. I hope so. She's Spain.
Thank you, Massimo.
Okay. Hi. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. Emily Rees, Senior Fellow at the European Center for International Political Economy. You are an international trade policy expert. You have been founder of Trade Strategies, a trade and regulatory consultancy advising government, business community, and civil society. And you also had an extensive career in EU affairs. In this global economic turmoil, Europe is in the middle of many geoeconomic and trade tensions, but Europe itself is also a trade giant. So will this tension lead Europe to a more political integration, political and economic integration, and to gain in control of some strategic value chain? Emily.
Thank you very much, Massimo. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning, and to Graham for that very insightful presentation from, the heart of maritime logistics. Your initial question was whether the supply logistical shocks that we're experiencing today are temporary, or are we going to see these become more structural trends? And in that regard, I think one of the points that I wanted to bring today is what is the policy of the European Union to build resilience and to look at these supply chains from a more holistic view. Obviously, we cannot today look at any European policy without considering it under the lens of the European Green Deal and the move towards a decarbonized economy. So we need to keep that in the setting. That will affect, obviously, maritime and other modes of transport as we move into the implementation phase of this wider decarbonization strategy. But when we're talking about trade, the European Union, and particularly this commission, the von der Leyen Commission, had said from the start that it would be a geopolitical Commission. And this came on the back end, I would say, of those big geoeconomic stretches, what we have seen over the past few years, and that were precedent to the pandemic and to these supply shocks. So in that regard, I think that some of these trends will be more structural. Now, the European Union's trade policy is based on an open strategic autonomy. And what that means essentially, or how it's been defined by the European Commission, is the following. It's an open strategic autonomy means cooperating multilateral whenever we can and acting autonomously wherever we must. And in this, we see, let's say, the fallback, I would say, of the Trump administration and some tensions, I would say, between the European Union and the US. Also a wider acknowledgement of China as a systemic rival of the European Union. So this particular strategic autonomy, this trade policy, is based essentially on three big pillars. One, which is resilience and competitiveness. And when we're talking about resilience, and I'll get back to that, the concept is understood to be one of repatriation, reviewing of industrial policy in order to see to create, to have less fragilities in European supply chains and also build more competitive industries. The second pillar is that of assertiveness on the world scene and rules-based cooperation, i.e. ensuring that the World Trade Organization rules are still respected worldwide, but taking unilateral measures when the EU feels that for some reason not doing so would be unfair. And that brings me to the third pillar, which is that of responsibility and fairness. What's meant here is actually much more a focus on enforcement. We're no longer in a period of great liberalization, of negotiation of free trade agreements. What we're doing is we're enforcing the rules of what already exists. And this trend is set to continue. The EU, in a way, has reached the limit of its liberalization now. It must remain open as that giant trading partner that you mentioned in the opening references here. But at the same time, it wants to see the trade in which it's engaging in to be slightly more fair. And that's where the carbon issue is going to come into play, but also other supply chain maneuvers. Now, again, the concept, I would say, of open strategic autonomy is really based on more independence and self-reliance than interdependence. And that's happening in a range of fields, not only trade. It's looking at defense, it's looking at industrial policy, digital policy, monetary policy, health policy. And that's obviously not only following the shock of the pandemic, but also I think it's more of a recognition, an acknowledgement of Europe's own vulnerabilities to external shocks, whatever those shocks may be, cyber attacks, climatic shocks, the type of shocks that we're going to be living in this next, I would say, era, if I may. So in this, we talk about often the repatriation, the repatriation of supply chains, the nearshoring. And in that way, I have to concur with what Graham says. I don't think this is going to be an overnight process, and nor is it systematically something that's going to occur. What will happen is that it's going to happen in very, very targeted sectors. And that is exactly what the European Union has been trying to do. Building, of course, on some of the more shocking points of the pandemic, where we had masks being seized off airport tarmacs between member states. I mean, that was quite a shocking moment, and there was a realization that perhaps some stockpiling in medical products could be of the essence if you are going to be confronting a pandemic and the next pandemic and the preparation for whatever next shock occurs. So in terms of the lessons that are being drawn by this current situation and how to build resilience, the European Union has once again started looking at revising its industrial strategy. It's identified essentially 14 ecosystems, industrial ecosystems in Europe, and underneath that, 137 products have been considered to be in sensitive sensitive ecosystems for which, for instance, the EU is entirely dependent on foreign sources. And I think that's really where we're getting to now. These are in specific strategic areas. It's not going to affect all the retail elements that Graham just presented, but we're talking about very specific areas. And this is critical raw materials. So this is rare earth, it's borate from Turkey, platinum from South Africa, it's batteries, it's active pharmaceutical ingredients, where also we have a reliance on maybe some very specific countries, hydrogen, semiconductors. I mean, we've definitely seen that the geopolitical tensions around Taiwan, which is one of the 2 manufacturers in the world of advanced chips, is coming into the fore here, and the EU wishes to see itself more independent in that realm, given how many industries depend on it. Again, what we're seeing is, and I think it was mentioned earlier, is a policy which is there to encourage this switch of strategies from the just-in-time to the just-in-case. And in that, it's going to be all about the kind of incentives that governments will offer companies in order to prepare and move into that model. And in that regard, that's where perhaps we can see a more structural element occurring because of the government aspect, the policies that will be put into place in order to shift companies' supply chains in, once again, very specific areas that have been pre-identified where the EU does have vulnerabilities. Where we're talking about more in energy-intensive industries, I won't get into the detail of it, but I mean, we're going to see more protections also that will have trade ramifications, but these protections will be climatic protections. So what we're talking about here is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Union wants to place, which essentially is going to level out prices worldwide, but encourages companies to supply themselves from the European Union. There is also, we really are looking at this fundamental element of how do we build resilience? And I think that one of the key elements that has come out of this crisis is that resilience is now considered a key organizational goal, that it be for governments or businesses, and it is strongly inscribed into policy development. And when we're talking about resilience, what are we talking about? We're not talking about robustness or risk adversity. We're talking about the ability to quickly rebound. And I think that Graham showed very clearly in the graphs that there is a rebound after this pandemic, or let's say in the aftermath of the worst parts of it. It's the ability to rebound from shocks. And so one of the things that we're seeing is also that exposure to small shocks actually helps build this resilience. So this is where, once again, we're going to see shifts that I believe will become more structural, probably not as drastic as some would imagine, but that will still have an impact.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your view. I personally fully agree, but I mean, is my view. We now move from Europe to a more Eurasian view with Ekaterina Kozyreva. And first of all, thank you very much for being here in Naples with us. You are president of IEC International, a center providing analytical support in macroeconomic background of transportation, but you also work as a research officer in Moscow State University, and you are an expert on rail freight, in particularly along the Eurasian corridor. So please give us your view from both the perspective of the transportation industry and sector and Eurasia region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Massimo.
Good morning. I think you have some slides, and
normally I have already seen them, but I can't see them anymore. Can you put on the slides, please? Thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, because I think that many of the participants are joining from other countries where it's already afternoon. I don't have a specific presentation, just some slides to demonstrate what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, when we are talking about global trade, the number one here is usually the maritime transportation. So here is the picture from the pre-pandemic connectivity. The years from 2016 to 2019 were characterized by a constant decrease of trade costs thanks to development inland transportation, the share of which is still very, very low. For example, for China connections, it was less than 2%. For India, European Union, India connections, it was less than 0.5%. So it was very, very small. But the point is that including and development of inland transportation allows decreasing of trade costs for landlocked countries and for all countries all along these ocean-to-ocean corridors, and not just for trading countries located, let me say, at the shore. So the years of 2016, 2019, thanks to the development of the New Silk Road series of initiatives, allowed the active development of inland trade. But even then, when looking at the trade structure for the commodity structure of exports from China to Europe and from Europe to China, you can see by colors that the balance could never be reached. And all the development in terms of resilience, in terms of sustainability, and now I'm not talking just about environmental things, but economic sustainability, was actually not sustainable. These years could have been used to build a more sustainable system, and there were calls from both international organizations and international forwarders and operators working for the Euro-Asian connections to establish a more balanced, more connected system that would allow balancing the trade flows, because anyway, transport reflects the trade flows. That was not done. And that is one of the reasons of the situation that we see right now, where in addition to these imbalanced flows, the artificial closure of borders and the asynchronous actions added even more imbalance to the system. So was this crisis that we observe right now eventual? No, that was not. Necessary actions were not taken by everyone. That's what the Euro-Asian rail freight flows look like in 2019. I'm not sure. I hope that those who are listening to us via YouTube can have a better vision, because it's a little bit far. But even here, you can see that the flows were never balanced, and the eastbound transportation was considerably higher than the volumes transported back. That's the point of putting together the values and volumes of transportation, which are never equal. Still, you can see that the role of the inland transportation and all the initiatives that were developed primarily by China, but not only, also by the Russian Federation, by Kazakhstan, and by Central Asian countries, were aimed at trade unlocking for those countries situated in Central Asia or other landlocked countries. The new southern routes started to develop from 2017, thanks to the efforts of the Kazakhstan side. But this situation changed. The pre-pandemic connectivity, the pre-pandemic inland supply chains required also subsidies and active digitalization. In the very end of 2019, or more exactly in the very beginning of 2020, just before the pandemic outbreak, together with the International Union of Railways, we modeled the contribution of various factors in development of Europe traffic by 2030, and we tried to evaluate the role of each factor. So the point is that the role of trade growth in developing the transportation and in developing the supply chains. And when I say transportation, I mean it as a whole, in developing connectivity, I may say like that. So the role of trade was even less than the role of other factors that could have been used to boost this transportation and thus to decrease the trade of costs, because that's the reason for developing all kinds of links. The role of interoperability was about 60%, and the role of digital interoperability could have become about 45%. But that never happened, because during the pre-pandemic connectivity, the connectivity trends, the transportation trends that were boosting the development of transport links and the development of supply chains were as follows. This was accessibility. As I have shown, new markets got access to new countries got access to global markets. Then that was, of course, automation, digitalization, integration, and sustainability. This is something that was really imposed. Since the beginning of the pandemic, these trends were broken. Some of them still exist, some of them are no more in place. The pandemic outbreak actually can be called a global connectivity crisis due to, first of all, to artificial efforts of the authorities, to artificial closures, and to the real crisis of integration. Many of the trends of the global connectivity are still in place, like automation, digitalization, but the integration trend has almost stopped. And it broke into integration by sub-regions, by regional unions, like, for example, the European Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN countries, and others. But the global integration as the corridor-based approach, unfortunately, disappeared. This is extremely sad because at the same time, there was a model competition consensus change. And in addition to Mr. Slack's presentation, there is a comparison of maritime and rail container indices. And that was exactly the moment when the inland transportation won its first prize and could have boosted the further economic developments. But due to the faults committed by both the authorities and the market players in the years 2016, 2019, when this imbalance was neglected, for example, the inland transportation system was not ready to take this challenge. And so despite the fact that even now the rail transportation is more interesting in terms of costs, the system itself and the level of its integration, the level of its equilibrium, its balance, does not allow using it more. So unfortunately, the positive things that are in place cannot be used by the marketplace and by the authorities. This also came together with a lake of black swans, like a series of events happening in the Suez canals, the channel, the problem of containers going away to the US ports, and some artificial closures of ports in China, as well as strikes in the South Africa. So all this together caused a kind of domino effect that is still in place, and that if there were not such faults committed before, this could have been better. The Euro-Asian rail freight flows in 2020 saw the increase of the inland transportation, which is a positive thing for all the countries located along the corridors. But will that last? Coming back to the trends, and I said that some of them were broken, primarily integration and also accessibility. Because of new programs imposed in some regions. We're talking about greener connectivity as a positive thing, and that definitely is. But in terms of transportation, what does it mean? This is definitely weight inequality. And most hit would be the countries that are already now either landlocked or developing, and especially for least developed countries, because the greener connectivity, together with incentive taxes policies, leads to deharmonization of international trade corridors and a growing cost of trade, further indebtedness for developing countries, which cannot allow being greener right now. And unless international support measures are proposed by international organizations, by development institutions, by the governments, this will be a problem for those countries that have just got access to global markets in Central Asia, in South Asia, and in many other regions all over the world, in Africa, of course, in Central and Western Africa as well. And besides, this will lead to inequality in terms of just one example, the global electric vehicle stock. This is not exactly about the supply chains, but this is also true for hydrogen technologies, for example. There is a limited number of countries possessing such technologies, and imposing them to other countries will be extremely unbalancing and complicated for those who do not have means to support it, unless some support measures are proposed by international organizations. This is also true for digitalization, which now goes along without integration. And there is actually no sense in creating ecosystems by subregions and not by corridors, because in this case, these subregional ecosystems will still require further integration, and they will not allow to significantly decrease the costs of trade between these subregions. So answering your first question, whether it is temporary or whether this will last for a long time, my suggestion is that it will last for a long time, and it will be extremely important, and this will lead to lower resilience in developing countries that will be most hit by this, by what we observe right now, and by additional incentive taxes, by new trends that we are about to follow in terms of connectivity, in terms of building supply chains, in terms of building sustainable supply chains. So my answer is not very positive. It's not okay, but of course, by now we do not see any international proposals on what to do with it, on how to act. And I'm doing the Rail Market Watch every quarter, and I see that by now there were just a few strategies proposed by the market players, and almost nothing proposed by the authorities, except for the European Union with a large-scale infrastructure development program, and the US. All other countries, and especially international organizations, they are about to propose it. So when updating the lending policies for banks in favor of sustainability, why not updating them also in terms of connectivity, in terms of trade costs decreasing? And this could be a solution to end the negative situation sooner.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Now, after three speakers, which were focused on shipping, trade, and transportation, we move to Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci. I think he's in line. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador.
Yes, good morning. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can't hear you.
I can hear you. I can
in any case, waiting for your microphone, I can say that you are chairman of the most prestigious Italian think tank in international affairs, Istituto Affari Internazionali. You have been Italian ambassador to the European Union and commissioner under the Barroso European Commission. You have a lot of experience in international affairs, and this is your perspective, of course, for this intervention. I would like to ask you a reaction to what you have heard until now. In particular, what is your view on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on international trade and global chain restructuring? Also, I'd like to add, in the wake of the last G20 and COP26, which to some extent, it seems to me, have shown that multilateralism is not yet dead. Ambassador, if you
Massimo, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly now, please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Sorry for not being with you in Naples, but a few remarks on COVID and on its impact on the global economy. First, it goes without saying, it has been the most dramatic emergency since several decades. It has had an impact on our sanitary system. It has had an impact on our social dimension, but most of all, it has had a dramatic impact on our economy because it has provoked the most serious global economic recession since 1945. It has been a typical symmetric shock, which has produced asymmetric consequences. Because if you look at the impact of COVID on national economies, you will see that it has hit in particular some sectors of economies more than others. For instance, the transport sector has been one of the most seriously affected. And it has hit all countries in the world, but not all at the same level and with the same gravity. By the way, it must also be recognized that practically all countries in the world, depending on their capabilities, their financial room of maneuver, they have adopted measures that were needed and necessary in the short run to offset the dramatic, in particular, social impact of COVID, with an enormous increase in public spending. Measures were not coordinated, but more or less they were convergent in their effects. The idea was to reduce the consequences of COVID in the economies and also in particular in our societies. Nevertheless, the impact, particularly last year, it has been disastrous. A global fall in GDP with points of about less than 10% compared to previous year. Now the situation is improving. There are very encouraging signs that the economy is recovering almost everywhere, including in Europe, which is a very good sign. And also because most countries in the world are adopting or have adopted already measures that are meant to support a sustainable growth. And I would come back on this qualification of the growth as sustainable. Europe, few words on Europe. It must be recognized and reminded that Europe, immediately after China, was the region in the world which was first and most affected by COVID in early spring 2020. But Europe is now showing very good signs of recovery and a certain confirmation of a capability for resilience. Despite the fact that Europe, and in particular the European Union, did not have specific competences on health, it was capable of adopting very important measures at the EU level. By the way, among others, the idea of a centralized system for the purchase of vaccines and distribution of vaccines among member states, something we tend to forget, but it has been a very useful decision by the European Union. But what really counts most is the fact that the European Union was capable to adopt a number of measures that were absolutely necessary to offset the economic consequences of COVID. I would like to remind some of them. First of all, the suspension of the rules on fiscal discipline and budgetary discipline, relaxation of rules on state aid, and then the two most important measures was the continuation by the ECB of the massive purchase of bonds, the PEPP program, which has helped countries to sustain their public debt. And last but not least, the Next Generation EU, by far the most important program of financial assistance by the Union to member states to support recovery and resilience in the post-COVID era and phase. Now the situation, as I was saying, is much more encouraging. The forecasts are all projected into the right side, if I may say so. The IMF, for instance, is projecting a global GDP growth for this year at global level of something like 5.5%, and for 2022 of 4.2, 4.4 for next year. International trade, which has suffered, as also the value chains have, is recovering. WTO has recognize that probably since the beginning of this year, we were already back at the level of the pre-COVID situation when it comes to international trade, which is a very, very good sign. And when it comes to the European Union, the Commission last forecast, the fall forecast, project a growth of GDP of the order of 5% this year and 4.4% for next year. So some countries will be able to go back to the pre-COVID level of GDP by the end of this year already. And public and private investment are also expected to grow. Now, a few words on the international scene, because COVID has also had an impact on the frame of international relations. The crisis of multilateralism has been aggravated. The agenda of numerous international institutions has been affected and modified or reshaped by the sanitary emergency. Also, the priorities of global governance have been redefined. We are unfortunately still in the middle of a situation which I would characterize as an unstable multipolar system. And on top of that, you also have to consider that the debt situation, both of states, households, and business, has worsened, and that socioeconomic challenges, particularly in fragile countries in the third world, have increased. And last but not least, inflation is back very clearly in the United States, with some more uncertain forecast for Europe. But there is a risk that a new wave of inflation may force new monetary policies by central banks. Some of them have already adopted tapering. Others are still waiting. I'm thinking in particular of the ECB, and this is going to be a very delicate point to observe because it may seriously affect the margin of maneuvers of individual governments in their fiscal policies. Two more developments that I would like to remind. Unfortunately, COVID has accentuated and even to a certain extent traumatized competition between China and US, which has become now the major feature in international relations. And there is a risk that this competition may move slowly into a confrontation. I hope this is not going to be the case. There are some encouraging signs more recent. And it has complicated the task of maintaining peace and stability. If you look around at the numerous regional crises, you would see that COVID has certainly, if not complicated the situation, it has certainly not helped solve some of those crises. So there is a need, which is widely recognized, to reestablish a more cooperative and predictable world order, to relaunch multilateralism and international cooperation. And there is a recognition that the challenges for the international community are enormous. And then I come to your observation on the two last events that are, as such, probably a reason for some more optimism. I'm thinking in particular at the recent G20 summit, which was held in Rome at the end of October, and the following COP26 conference in Glasgow. None of them, to be very clear, none of them has produced spectacular concrete results. We have to be very honest in this. There have been some progresses here and there in Rome, in the area, for instance, of fiscality. There was a clear commitment, which is good, to register on the need to reform and relaunch WTO, since we're speaking in particular global trade. But the atmospherics and some also achievements were achieved, were resulted in Glasgow. But what really counts is the fact that countries, the most important countries of the world, by the way, were capable and willing to talk to each other. It's true that nor Xi Jinping or Putin were present in these two events, but this is not what really makes the difference. I think that it's important that both China and Russia were there in a sense. They have contributed to the results. And in particular, I would like to note two specific developments, one of which took place in Rome. It had nothing to do with the agenda of the G20, but it was the announcement by President Biden and President of the Commission von der Leyen of the decision to suspend tariffs on imports from the US to Europe and from Europe to the US. A very meaningful decision because the end of a trade war, which was started at the time of the Trump administration, good not only for economic reasons, but also because it meant that the EU and US were ready to collaborate once more on a very sensitive issue, which has to do with the very essence of international trade. And the second, which was announced in Glasgow, was an agreement between the US and China. Although vague in its content, it nevertheless confirmed that both countries first recognized the importance to act together against and to combat climate change, and that they're ready to talk to each other in this regard in a situation where on other issues they are quite distant and far away from each other. Now, a few very short considerations to conclude my remarks. There are nevertheless, despite these encouraging signs, some lessons that need to be drawn. First is that as far as COVID is concerned, we are not yet out of the emergency. As the situation in Europe is demonstrating, we must continue to be vigilant, and including in that respect measures needed to contain contagions and to spread the use of vaccines. But there is a need to increase international cooperation to be able to distribute vaccine all over the world. There are countries where the rate of vaccination is extremely low, and this is a risk for the whole of mankind. So more work needs to be done on preparedness and prevention of epidemics. It is, this time it's COVID, next time could be something else. Second point, we are all committed to strengthen economic growth and to relaunch sustainable economic growth. But I think it's important that we are able collectively to better coordinate our national or regional measures in order to avoid disequilibria that may develop in this effort. So, and there is a need in this respect to improve the functioning of some essential international institutions that have direct competences in this area. And I'm thinking in particular at WTO. The recognition of the need to reform WTO was clearly reaffirmed in Rome at the G20 summit. Third point, climate. On climate in Glasgow, countries recognized, I think this is the major achievement, that it's a common challenge which needs to be tackled by common efforts. There were agreements on some targets, quantitative targets, even though there were disagreements on the timing of the attainment of these targets. And there were a number of measures that were only agreed by a limited number of countries. I'm thinking of reduction of emission of methane, I'm thinking of deforestation. But altogether, even though without spectacular results, the commitment were important and the direction assumed is the correct one. Now, in particular, I'm thinking at Europe, the moment of truth has arrived. We are confronted with the need to adopt a package of measures known as Fit for 55, which are, by the way, important, but also costly. So we need to be very vigilant in striking the right balance between cost and benefits of those measures if we want to maintain our commitment when it comes to decarbonization, energy transition, and contrast of climate change. So these are my remarks. I apologize for being too general, probably excessively general if compared to the previous speakers. But thank you, Massimo, once more for inviting me to this very important dialogue of continents.
Thank you, Ambassador. Not general things, very interesting view and position. I think it's 11, so we are closing our session. I mean, unfortunately, we do not have time to make a second round. I think I want just to quote one thing Ambassador said. He said relance of multilateralism and cooperation as a key point for the future. And I think that in a different way, in a different scale, of course, is what we are doing today. Dialogue of continents. Dialogue is the first step for cooperation. Dialogue between people, dialogue between different cultures, dialogue between people coming from different countries. It's also a way to build multilateralism. So with these words, we close this first session. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nelly Feroci, Ekaterina Kozyreva, Emily Rees, and Graham Slack for being with us. And please, for all the people online, stay with us. We will have just a short break, then we will restart at 11:30 with session 2 on the economic and social impact of COVID-19 pandemic. See you soon, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Massimo.
I can take it off. Okay. Meglio. Better. Okay. So we can start again. We are some minutes late. It's also my fault. I apologize for that. My train from Rome was a little late. Anyway, my name is Andrea de Petris. I'm here as scientific director of the Center of European Policy in Italy, which is the Italian branch of the Center for European Politics, based in Freiburg in Germany and with another office in Paris. My task here is to lead the discussion for this panel, and I am very thankful for having me here today. This is the first time for me to meet this organization. It's going to be quite interesting. I'm very sure about that. So I think we can start with the first participant to this panel, which is, according to the program I have here, is Ms. Marco Lombardi, senior economist by IS. I think he should be already connected with us, is correct?
No, it's me.
It's you, sorry about that. I thought that I should start with people connected and then having you, but sorry about that. So
no, it's okay, don't worry.
I'm very sorry. Okay, so since you are here, Marco Lombardi, I am very pleased to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So can you please put the slides? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is how the legacy of COVID-19 has affected and will affect inequality looking ahead, and what this implies in terms of challenges for monetary and fiscal policy. I should say that I'm speaking in my own personal capacity and not on behalf of the institution I represent. So that's my personal views on the matter, even though most of the material I'm going to present is based on last year's issue of the BIS Annual Economic Report, and you can refer to that for additional details. So let me start by remarking that one defining aspect of COVID-19 has been its heterogeneity across sectors. Now, to be sure, all recessions have that feature in the sense that normally a recession starts from a shock in a given sector, and that's hit more than the others. So by definition, recessions are heterogeneous. But COVID-19 is special in that certain sectors had to be completely shut down. And those sectors happen to be those in which there's a higher proportion of low income and low skilled workers. Think about restaurants, for example. Now, what does that mean for inequality is that the pandemic has hit more unfortunate workers in a disproportionate way. And you can see that in this graph. So in the left-hand panel, we have an estimate of the probability of losing job during the pandemic. This is based on some Eurostat calculations for European countries. And you see that the blue diamonds, that is the probability of job loss for low-income workers, is much higher than for the high-income workers. And this is especially so for the countries that had been more hit by the global financial crisis. In the US, the picture is similar. The right-hand panel shows a different type of measure, that's employment by income. You see that the red line, that is the level of employment for those on a high income in the top quartile of the income distribution, is dropping, of course, when the recession hits, but then recovering fast. While the blue line, the income for the employment for those in below median income, fails to recover to the pre-COVID levels. So these people, the more disadvantaged, they tend to be still unemployed after, well, more than 1 year after the recession. Now, what this means is that you can really see that from the right-hand panel, that you have a wedge between the workers in the top quartile and those below the median. And this wedge is something that defines what happens to inequality after the recession hits. And this is something you can visualize better in this other graph. So here I report the level of employment and the level of the Gini index after around the moment the recession hits. That's the vertical black line. You see that unemployment obviously increases, but then eventually recovers as the recovery takes hold. In contrast, inequality, as measured here by the Gini index, is on an increasing path and seems to not to really go back to the pre-recession levels. So this is something that you could label as a sort of inequality hysteresis. So inequality tends to persist and linger on even after the recovery takes hold. And this is the word I used in the title of my presentation. Now, again, this is something you can see across all recessions. This graph is based on an average type of recession across advanced and emerging economies, but it is even more so for COVID, given its depth and breadth of impact. Now, what does this leave us? Unemployment is going to subside eventually when the recovery takes hold. And now, as other speakers have mentioned in the first session this morning, we're facing a wave of inflation, not least driven by supply side bottlenecks. Now, that's bad news for inequality as well. Inflation tends to hit disproportionately the poorest and the more disadvantaged in the economy. This is so because the poorest, they typically rely on labor as their main source of income, and wages are typically expressed in nominal terms and revised only occasionally. So this graph reports a simulation of what happens to real wages, that is the purchasing power of a worker who only relies on its labor income, under two different scenarios for inflation. One is very high inflation, 20%. This is something that, I mean, advanced economies should not really face. But the other one, 5%, is something that we are actually seeing at the moment in the US, for example. And you see that when the indexing of wages is quarterly, this is the light lines in the graphs, the reduction in purchasing power is sort of tiny. When indexing is annual, so every year the salaries are adjusted for past inflation, the loss of purchasing power is kind of sizable. So inflation is bad news for inequality as well. So the other reason I brought up inflation in my talk is that inflation, stable prices, and full employment are two of the key mandates in most charters of central banks in advanced and emerging economies. So it follows that if central banks manage to deliver on their mandated objectives of stable prices and full employment to the extent possible, they're giving their best contribution to mitigating these two sources of inequality that I've just highlighted. Now that said, in spite of the relative success that central banks have achieved, especially in advanced economies, in delivering low and stable inflation and pushing hard on employment, you can see from the left-hand panel of this graph that inequality, here measured by the Gini index, that's the solid lines, and the share of income that accrues to the top 10% earners, that's the dashed lines. This has been on the rise since the mid-80s, roughly, especially so in advanced economies. And as I said, in spite of stable inflation and relatively muted business cycles. So that means that there are other structural forces that have pushed inequality higher. A similar picture goes for wealth inequality that I visualize in the right-hand panel. Here, the data is patchier and less reliable, not least because to measure wealth inequality, you need to take a stance on how to evaluate illiquid assets, and that's not a trivial process. But still, for the countries for which we have available data, you see that the measures of wealth Gini index have been on the rise. Interestingly, this increasing concentration of income and wealth is mainly driven by what happens at the very top of the income and wealth distribution. There I show the share of income to the top 10%, but if you go more granular, and I really don't have time to go that into details, but you see that especially in some advanced economies, the greatest contribution to the increasing concentration of income and wealth is the top 0.1%, that is the very top reach. So let me now come to the, I'd say, more analytic part of my presentation. So why do central banks worry about inequality, and why they're right to do so? Well, as I said earlier, they do bring their best contribution by controlling inflation and output. So that's set. But under circumstances in which inequality is pushed higher by other structural factors, inequality becomes a structural feature of the economy that then shapes macroeconomic outcomes, and that central banks need to take into account. And let me highlight two aspects. So the first one, and this is the evidence I report on this graph, is that inequality exacerbates business cycle fluctuations, and so it makes recessions deeper and longer. Here we compare the impact of a typical recession in terms of cumulative consumption growth for countries with low, median, and high inequality. And you see that high inequality countries, the yellow bar, has experienced much larger drops in cumulative consumption. This is possibly because in such countries, there's a larger proportion of workers that are particularly vulnerable to shocks and lack an adequate protection when they go unemployed. The second point I want to highlight, and this is especially relevant for central banks, is that inequality can also dampen the transmission of monetary policy. So why is it so? Well, you can follow a similar reasoning. You have in the economy, in a very polarized economy, you have a lot of workers on very low incomes. These workers, they may be willing to avail of monetary accommodation by the central banks, but they may fail to do so because maybe they lack collateral to access credit, or even their income is too unstable to grant them loans. So they cannot benefit from low rates. Instead, the rich, they could benefit from low rates, but maybe they have less of an interest to do so because their consumption is already high and they have no interest in expanding it. So this is why we find this empirical evidence, again, across advanced and emerging economies, that a monetary stimulus boosts consumption more in low inequality countries, that's the red bar in the graph, vis-a-vis high inequality countries, the yellow bars. That's more than double the effect of monetary stimulus. Now, this is something relevant for central banks because you can put all the pieces together and come up to something that looks like a worrisome amplification mechanism. You start with a recession. A recession, as we said, jacks up inequality due to the effect of unemployment. Higher inequality lingers on and leads to deeper recessions in the future. And this, in turn, higher inequality also weakens the monetary policy transmission mechanism and forces central banks to deploy more and more accommodation to recover from a recession. This is bad news because it puts a lot of burden on the shoulders of central banks, which is definitely unwelcome, and also because a side effect of monetary accommodation, especially asset purchases, is that it does boost asset prices. And so in a sense, it by design jacks up wealth inequality, which is also an unwelcome result. So this is very troubling news for central banks to operate in a high inequality environment. Now there's a tool, however, that is pretty efficient in fighting against this structural inequality trend, and that tool is in the hands of governments, and that's fiscal policy. What I show in this graph is the change in inequality from the measured by the Gini index from the pre-tax pre-transfer, that's the red bars, to the post-tax and post-transfer, the blue bars. That is after the government interventions have done their job in equalizing the income distribution. And you see that there's quite a substantial difference between the two bars, especially so for advanced economies in which the social safety net or the redistribution policies are more developed. The reason fiscal policy is so powerful is that, contrary to monetary policy, fiscal policy can be precisely targeted towards specific segment of the income distribution. You can target the high income households by promoting a progressive taxation, and so redistributing more income away from those high income households. And you can do the opposite, that is promote redistribution through transfers to the low income households. And this is something you can see in the left-hand panel of this graph, where you can see that over time, the tax systems have become less progressive in advanced economies, but the extent of public transfers has increased. So in practice, the tax systems have become, in a sense, more geared towards promoting equality at the bottom of the income distribution, that's the right-hand panel, compared to redistributing income away from those at the top, that's the center panel. So this brings me to the end of my talk, and let me stress the points I would like you to take away. The first is that monetary policy, central banks can best contribute to mitigate the amplification of inequality over business cycles and through recessions by delivering on their mandated objectives of price stability and full employment. Fiscal policy on its side has all the necessary tools to achieve the desired distribution of income and wealth according to the wishes of the constituencies. And so successful monetary and fiscal cooperation can prevent this inequality hysteresis that follows recession and that generates an environment that is unwelcome for the operation of central banks. Thanks for your attention, and happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Marco. I don't know how is this organization. It's supposed that every single panelist should have questions. Okay, so we can open the, at the end of all presentations. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so we can go on strictly with the next participant, which is Phoebe Koundouri, which is supposed to be connected with us, I guess, unless she's hiding somewhere.
I am, no, I'm not hiding.
Economics and Director.
I'm here.
Excuse me?
I'm not hiding, I'm here.
Okay, fine.
You can see me on the screen.
Okay, thank you for being with us. And if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will talk more about how we can, especially in Europe, but also across the world, try to overcome COVID. And in what way we should do that in order to achieve a transition to sustainability that will be beneficial for our economy, for our society, and for the conservation of the environment on which our economy and society depends. Looking at the world now, we see a multiple crisis scene. we see COVID-19, the huge recession that derives from it, climate change, the increase in intensity and severity of extreme weather events, which are caused by the increase in average global temperature, and the even bigger crisis of biodiversity collapse, which is a huge issue, even bigger in terms of its potential detrimental effects to climate change. We work as an international cluster for research on the sustainability transition, and we try to produce research, but also transform this research and innovation that is produced into sustainability action. This cluster is composed of a number of institutions and networks that I lead: the Research Laboratory on Socioeconomic and Environmental Sustainability at the Athens University of Economics and Business, the Sustainable Development Unit at the Athena Research and Innovation Center. This is the biggest center in the country, research center in the country focused on information technology. And there we do a lot of research on the green and digital transition. The IT Climate Kit, sponsored by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and focusing on accelerating innovations and startups that are relevant for the transition to a climate neutral economy. And with this research and acceleration institutions, we also work as UNSDSN, the UN Initiative for Sustainable Development Solutions, which aims to promote the solutions that are produced by universities and research institutions and are relevant for sustainability transition to the stakeholders that are supposed to implement the transition: the businesses, the banking system, the policymakers, the politicians, the civil society as a whole. I call it SDSN Europe and SDSN Greece, with more than 400 institutional members in SDSN Europe. So we work on research and innovation acceleration, education and training, and the policy interface. Of course, this transition is to be science-driven, but it's also important to have the right policies in place in order to accelerate implementation. And we have a lot of policies that are in place at the moment. Some are compulsory, some are in the form of laws, and some others are global agreements that have been signed. Commitments have been made, and we hope that they will be implemented. So in 2015, we have the SDGs 17 goals for their achievement. Is vision in 2030, 169 targets within these goals, and goals that refer to the triple vision of a sustainable environment, economy, and society. We have the Paris Agreement, of course, a few months later, again 2015, where we have the 197 countries signing to keep global temperature at below 2 degrees Celsius increase compared to what we have during the pre-industrial era. 2018, the IPCC report tells us that the maximum increase we can live in, given the technology we have, is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in 2019 Climate Week, New York, we present as SDSN the 6 transformations that need to be implemented in order to operationalize the SDGs, grouping the SDGs in different transformation consistent with the organizations of government, consistent, that is, with the ministerial structure in most countries in the world. And this refers to education, health, energy, decarbonization, sustainable industry, sustainable production of food and use of land, water, and oceans, sustainable cities and communities, and the digital revolution for sustainable development. By the end of 2019, we have the European Green Deal, where we have the climate neutrality axis by 2050, the protection of human life from pollution, clean tech leadership for European companies, and of course, making the transition without leaving anyone behind, an inclusive transition. The European Green Deal is supported by 1 trillion over the period 21-2030, some of it to be financed by the EU budget, and some of it hoped to be leveraged by public-private partnerships. And of course, the European Green Deal has to be, which is the new growth strategy of Europe, has to be implemented in a consistent way with the European semester process, which is the process that the Commission monitors country macroeconomic performance every 6 months and gives policy recommendations. 2020, unfortunately, we have the pandemic. We had short-run measures to support the vulnerable from the pandemic, vulnerable citizens, the financial system, because non-performing loan mountains, the SMEs to protect them from bankruptcy. But also we have the medium-term response of Europe, the Next Generation EU, 750 billion in addition to multi-annual financial framework, which basically keeps the European Green Deal as a growth strategy of Europe and allows these investments to be focused on green and digital transition. 37% of the investment that is going to be funded by Next Generation EU needs to be green, and 20% needs to be digital. And 2021 is the year where we have hectic transposition of all European Green Deal policies and structures and regulations into law. We have the climate law, 2050, climate neutrality, 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this is the first time that we put these commitments into a legal obligation. We also have the EU taxonomy, which identifies which investments are green, climate change mitigation, adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution prevention, and biodiversity. And together with that, we have the proposal for a corporate sustainability reporting directive, which extends the scope of the companies that have an obligation to submit such a report, and it also introduces auditing, detailed reporting requirements, and digital tagging of the reported information. Together with this, we have the 13 legislative proposals in the climate package Fit for 55, where we have the revision of all major policies that are relevant to tackling climate change, revision of the ETS, revision of the effort sharing regulation, the revision of the land use and land use change regulation, a proposal for a border adjustment mechanism, the revision of renewable energy directive, efficiency directive, the creation of a social facility for climate actions to support the vulnerable, the revision of energy taxation, EU forest, and of course the revision of all that has to do with mobility, cars, vans, aviation, and maritime, now all under effort sharing regulation. And all this is happening in Europe, of course, but also across the world. Although Europe is a leader because it has policy enactment and laws that are relevant for the implementation, at the moment we have an unprecedented momentum for commitments to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions across the globe, including China, including India, including US, Canada, and parts of Africa and Latin America. And of course, we need to act fast, and we need to act fast means transposing these pledges, commitments into policies, regulations, and laws, because we know that we are on a track of +4, 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial level, a level of global temperature that we cannot live in. We cannot afford to live in this. And these are our ways to go forward. Our ways to go forward is digital and green, improve connectivity, develop digital skills, deploy cutting-edge technologies, improve cybersecurity, decarbonize power, promote circular economy, protect and restore biodiversity, and of course, green mobility. The results from the COP, I was there, I had 2 speeches, I followed tens of speeches and events, are very optimistic. And this is coming from somebody who has been a member, an observer in COP since 2020. And why is it optimistic? Not just because we have 40 countries with pledges for climate neutrality by 2050, China by 2060, India by 2070. The 2 China and India are, of course, too late, but this is not what makes me optimistic. What makes me optimistic is that the first time I've seen businesses and financial institutions understand the wealth of opportunities that is in the green transition. And the wealth of opportunities derives from the fact that technological advancement is giving us renewables, circular economy, nature-based solutions, adaptation projects, and digitalization at a unit cost that is very competitive to alternatives to fossil fuels. And of course, it creates a wealth of profitable opportunities. And what we need to do is to gather the results from the COP, the UN Food System Summit, the G20, and the forthcoming UN Biodiversity Conference in China, and make sure that we engage in policies, regulation, and laws that will accelerate the implementation of the green and digital transition in the developed world, and at the same time make fiscal space for the less developed world, the global south, to be able to engage in a green and digital recovery from COVID. And in order to do that, we need to increase lending to multilateral development banks to provide the low-income developing countries with funding that will enable them to embark in this transition, and also will enable technology transfer from the developed to the developing world in a way that we create public-private partnerships that will accelerate the transition and will create profitable situations. Every year in SDSN Europe, which I co-chair, we produce the Sustainable Development Report, which shows how well each country is responding to the implementation of the SDGs. But what I wanted to show you a bit more is the second report that we do on the joint transformations for the joint implementation of Agenda 2030 for a green, digital, job-based, and inclusive recovery. So this report basically that I lead with Jeff Sachs basically connects the 4 major policy initiatives in Europe, SDGs, the European European Green Deal, the European semester process, and the EU Next Generation, and creates actionable strategies that can guide EU-wide and national economic recovery in line with Europe's overreaching sustainability agenda. And of course, our major result there is that beyond fiscal stimulus that is expected to boost aggregate demand, fiscal stimulus related to COVID, this crisis calls for transformative public investments that will shape a sustainable green and digital future and create the conditions, the economic conditions and situations that can leverage private sector investment. And in this report, we showcase the close relationship between European Green Deal and the SDG via machine learning. And then we see how the European semester process reflects the achievement of SDG per country. So if you have achieved SDG, which is a green SDG, then this SDG does not need a recommendation for improvement in the from the European semester process. Just give me a minute. Anigis. If the SDG is red or orange, then we should see some recommendation from the European semester process, because it means that in this particular area, the country is not performing as well as it should. And it's the same for yellow, although yellow means that there is progress and a hope for the achievement of the SDG by 2030, we still need to invest more. Sweden, which is one of the most sustainable country, has an alignment between the European semester process and the SDGs by 50%, and Germany 63%, and Greece 80%, and in total Europe 72%, which is a quite good percentage. However, this transition cannot only be implemented through policies, laws and regulations and the blueprints of the SDGs and the European Green Deal. It needs to be a technological transition. The main driver is technology. So what we need to do is find the optimal mixture of renewable, circular economy, nature-based solutions, climate adaptation projects, and digitalization that will achieve that we've paved the pathway for the implementation. And the European Green Deal, together with the SDGs, should be conceived on a systems approach, simultaneously addressing multiple objectives and promoting the right mixture of policy instruments and technological solutions for the various sectors of the economy. We need to
Professor Koundouri.
Yes, yes.
Excuse me to interrupt you. I have to ask you to come to your conclusions, because we have two other panelists to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we give recommendations what should be done in the power, industry, transport, building sectors, in the land use and food systems. And we also give recommendations for sustainable patient finance, how we need to restructure our finance system at macro level, meso level, and micro level in order to provide the patient long-term strategic finance that will support sustainable innovation. And of course, while supporting the transition with policies and finances and technologies and paving and developing the right pathways, you need to care for the vulnerable. The vulnerable are relevant questions for the vulnerable. Is how many new jobs will the European Green Deal create? About 1 million, but also those that will be regressively affected by climate policy should be mitigated. And we showcase a package of measures that can mitigate the regressive effects to those that are disproportionately affected by climate loss. And you can read the report and figure that out, but mainly it's about lump sum transfers from climate revenues, targeted energy efficiency measures, job retraining programs, and funding of subsidies. In this way, we can recover for COVID in a way that we implement the green and digital transition, and at the same time, we can ensure more equality in terms of Gini coefficients, increased GDP and employment in Europe. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Koundouri. And so I go straight to the next panelist, which is Jaroslav Lisovolik. I hope I pronounce the name correctly.
Yes. No, this is absolutely correct. Everything is in order. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction. And dear colleagues, a warm greeting from Moscow. Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to deliver to you my views on the economic situation, which mostly I will be focusing on the case of Russia and how it illustrates some of the challenges that countries face with regard to the pandemic. I think clearly one of the key things to observe is the unprecedented scale of uncertainty that economies face in the context of this pandemic. We see, I think, not just in Russia, but across the globe, widening divergence between forecasts and outcomes and economic outcomes. And accordingly, what we increasingly need in terms of economic analysis is leading indicators, analysis of big data, including in segments of the economy that have to do with the labor market, because I think the labor market was probably one of the segments of the economy most affected by the pandemic. And if we look at Russia's case, what we see is clear signs of labor shortage in some of the segments of the economy that were particularly affected by COVID, and this concerns services, this concerns sectors such as IT. We see in some of these segments already clear signs of wage pressures, and in the context of the trends that were discussed already in the previous speeches regarding increases in inflation, this is yet another factor coming from the labor market, whereby increasing competition for specialists, especially in segments of the labor market that have to do with high-skilled jobs. This is something that is leading to wage pressures and possibly further contributions to this inflationary momentum. We see increases in vacancies in Russia, roughly 1.5 times higher in terms of the number compared to the pre-pandemic period, whether we take official stats or if we take stats from Headhunter, which is the agency that deals with vacancies. Orders of magnitude are roughly the same. And sectors that are especially affected, they seem to be also those that rely particularly on migrants, on labor migration. This is segments like construction, for example. And Russia has been a major player in the sphere of migration. Before the pandemic, it was one of the largest recipients of labor migrants in the world. More than 10 million, mostly from the near abroad, mostly from the former Soviet Union economies. And the byproduct of that, of course, was sizable remittances that were coming from Russia to countries such as Tajikistan or countries such as Uzbekistan. Those were some of the largest recipients with remittances reaching for these economies at times 45 to 50% of GDP per annum. This is several times of their annual budgets. And of course, the pandemic led to a notable reduction in the scale of these remittances. Official figures based on those that we see from the Central Bank of Russia suggest something on the order of 20%. It was around 13 billion in 2019 in terms of the flow of remittances from Russia to the near abroad, and 11 billion last year, and possibly even lower this year. So this is obviously something that is having an effect on the well-being of those in the near abroad, on the well-being of migrants that frequently have to go back to their countries, and this increases social pressures there, could lead to higher levels of unemployment, etc. And of course, this migration issue is coming on top of the demographic issue that Russia was facing even before the pandemic. It was facing a reduction in the population because of the this differential between fertility and mortality. And then comes in the pandemic factor. And of course, this further worsens the demographic outlook and has implications for long-term growth. And with regard to the growth issue, Russia's growth performance has not been tremendous, let's put it this way. In the preceding years before the pandemic, if you take the period from 2014 to 2020, the average annual growth rate was around 0% actually. But the focus seems to be, even in the midst of this underperformance on the growth front, in terms of the response with regard to the pandemic, the macroeconomic response seems to be focused on building reserves rather than boosting short-term growth. And what we see is further buildup in these reserves. We see something like $211 billion in the National Well-Being Fund accumulated on the back of high commodities prices and increases in central bank reserves. So within the balance within this dichotomy between growth and stability, Russia's authorities seem to accord greater weight with regard to macroeconomic stability. And that partly may be warranted also by the fact that we're seeing that the effect of the pandemic is more long-term. There are more waves of the pandemic, and clearly the economic effect of the pandemic is exceeding expectations that were out there previously. Finally, very briefly, while the growth in Russia is relatively low, especially in the preceding years, there is significant divergence across sectors. And what we see is sizable increase in the dispersion and growth rates across sectors, nearly 4 to 5-fold increase in 2020 compared to 2017. Outperformers include financial, 7% growth per annum, IT as well. And that outperformance could, in the long term, be further exacerbated by factors such as green economic development, ESG, importance of ESG. These are the sectors that seem to be relatively stronger in these areas compared to the resource sectors of Russia that used to be the mainstay of the economy. Finally, at the corporate level, not just at the sectoral level, we see also divergence. We see that there's rising market concentration. The IMF has been talking about rising market concentration. We see signs of that in Russia. The share of 5 leading food retailers increased by about 4 percentage points last year to exceed 32% in Russia's retail space. So this is something that we're also observing, and accordingly, the conclusion on my side is that unbalanced growth, unbalanced development is still a major challenge, and it needs to be, as has been mentioned by other speakers on this panel, needs to be dealt with through a combination of fiscal and monetary policy. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaroslav Lizovolich, for your contribution and also for being very effective in your presentation. So I come to the last panelist of our panel today, which is Kyo Yaid, or Yid, I don't know exactly the pronunciation in this case, President of Shanghai Research Development Foundation. If you are connected, are you with us? Yes, it seems like that.
Can you hear me?
Okay, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to attend
excuse
the
me,
panel.
excuse me for the interruption. Can you slightly move your camera so we can see your face, not just a part of it?
I don't know how to do that.
Just to, I think we just move it a little, the orientation on the top so we can see all of you, if it's possible.
Let me see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's okay. No.
A little higher.
It's okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'm happy to attend the panel. I learned lots from previous presenter. Today, I'm going to focus talking about the situation in China. As you know, relative to other economies, the Chinese economy has been doing better since the outbreak of a pandemic. Last year, Chinese GDP grows at 2.3%, which I guess is only one of large economy which get a positive growth rate. The major reason, I guess, behind that is the Chinese government has been taking a very strict approach to deal with COVID. They call it clean up to zero approach. Whenever they find a case appears, they take a very severe approach to deal with it. So in China, now we live fairly normal life, except when we enter to the public field, we have to wear masks or show our green coat on our mobile phone. The success of this approach is due to several reasons. One is probably due to the special social structure and a cultural habit. For example, I guess most people here are willing to give up partial personal freedom and partial privacy for the collective interest. Also, high tech play very important role in this regard because most Chinese now using smartphone almost everywhere. Of course, it is unlikely other countries could copy or use the Chinese approach. Also, approach itself is not without cost. Actually, consumption in China lag behind its export. So far, export doing very well in China. I guess that's the major driving force to push Chinese economy forward. Of course, I don't think this situation can be sustainable for a long time. For example, if we look at the data, we can find that in past several months, the economic growth in China literally slowing down. For example, GDP growth rate in the first quarter of this year is 18.3%. Second quarter, 7.9%. The third quarter, only 4.9%. Of course, the reason is because the growth rates on we call low base effect. Last year, the beginning of last year, the growth rate was negative. So last year, the growth rate is from low to high. So that's enabled Chinese economy growth rate this year from high to low. Generally, I guess Chinese economy still can get 8% by the end of this year, according estimation of IMF, according the estimation of World Bank. Although Chinese government put a very low objective for growth rate, only 6%. So I guess China still face several uncertainty and challenging. First of all, they cannot always take the approach of zero cleanup approach. Otherwise, they have to be isolated by the rest of the world, because so many countries started to open door for international travelers. But China have to move from this current approach to more open up. But I don't think it will happen until the end of Olympic Games, which will happen February next year. So that's the first challenge or uncertainty. Second uncertainty or challenge, it have to make a balance between reasonable growth and physical and financial risks. Probably you heard some news. One of large real estate developer in China, Evergrande, have troubles with the dealing with pay their debts. That is something Chinese governments have to deal with. The last challenging or uncertainty is the relationship between China and the United States. That's with the Trump administration, the relationship between these two countries get worse until the Biden administration. I guess several days ago, President Xi Jinping and President Biden had a video meeting. I guess the general feeling get a little bit easy, but the competition between these two countries are still there. Also will last a very, very long time. At least probably will last next 2 or 3 decades. These environments definitely will hold both countries, also will hold the rest of the world. So in summary, I guess there are the 3 challenges Chinese now are facing. First of all, they have to deal a pandemic impact more smoothly from tough approach to more open to the rest of the world. Second approach, they have a second challenging. They have to make a balance between economic growth and the financial risk. The third one is they have to deal worsening tension of relationship between US and China. So I just stop here.
Thank you very much, for your presentation. We actually are quite on time because we started at 11:38. I think we have some minutes for possible questions or remarks that people from the presence are here. Please. I think we need a microphone for possible questions. Otherwise, yes, otherwise the guests connected with us cannot listen to the questions. Thank you.
I have one question for Mr. Jaroslav Lisobolik.
Excuse me, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Petr Roman.
Thank you.
I'm professor in physics of environment and former Prime Minister of Romania. But right now I prefer to speak as a professor in physics of environment and also the economy of the environment. A question to Mr. Lisobolik. I think he was very clear about the weaknesses of the economic landscape of Russia. My question is, when Mr. Lisobolik would see a radical change in the Russian economy in that sense, that for the time being, Russia is strongly connected, globally connected to the global economy through resources, natural resources. And also his weaponry, his military armament. But when Russia would be much more connected with the global economy on other fields, like creativity, innovation, and so on, in order to see that the Russian economy is relying less on natural resources than on what is actually what are actually the real drivers of the global economy. Connection with the real drivers of the global economy. And a question to Mr. Yadi from China. Yeah. Isn't it a contradiction? And how if it is so, how it could be solved? A contradiction between, on one hand, this approach, this isolationist approach, which indeed brought great success in combating the pandemic, but nevertheless a contradiction with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is exactly opening to the world. Let's remember that the main mantra, the main idea of the Chinese reform was open up. When China is coming back to open up? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Mr. Lisobolik first, and then Mr. Yaid.
Thank you very much indeed for the question, and I would actually challenge the view that my presentation focused squarely on the weaknesses. I think some of the significant strengths of Russia's economy, I think I mentioned as well, and those have to do with the reserves. Actually, if you take the IMF measure of reserves across countries, then an integral measure of that is one of the highest for Russia across countries. And then there's, of course, the very low level
it's
of
about
debt.
reserves coming still from natural resources, because
Sure.
the prices of the natural resources went up. So my point is not there.
I haven't finished. Yes. No, I agree that the issue of dependency is still there, but there are certain policy measures that are underway. I think when you ask the question of when we will see the change, I think probably it has to be the switch in gear, whereby the economy starts to prioritize growth to a greater degree and to spend some of those reserves. The big question is going to be how it's going to be spent, how effectively it's going to be spent. And I think if the priority is towards human capital development, if this is education, if this is healthcare, then the long-term possibilities and the potential growth rate will benefit significantly. There are already measures underway in this regard, and you may have heard about the national projects, the so-called national projects, which are a very significant allocation from the budget towards longer-term goals that have to do with demographics, with education, with healthcare, not just in the leading regions of the country, but across the wide expanse of Russia. So I think there is certainly hope that Russia will affect that transformation, and some of the important policies in this regard, in my view, are already underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yaid. This was a second question for you.
Yes. I agree. There is a big challenging for China to make a balance between I call zero approach, deal with the pandemic and continue open up. But the one thing I have to point, but now it's not totally closed down for international travelers, but still they have a very strict law on international travel. For example, if you travel from abroad, enter into China, you have to 14-day quarantine. Of course, it will hold the communication, they will hold the personnel exchange. That's the issue I guess China have to deal with. For example, like the US, open door, allow anyone get a vaccine approved from WHO. I guess China have to deal with that. I guess sooner or later, they have to follow the suit, just like the US. They have to open to international travels.
Thank you very much. There are other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to make a remark on Professor Koundouri's presentation. So at some point you didn't really dwell on that, but you mentioned central banks' active role in promoting greening of the economy, environmental considerations, and so on. So this is something indeed that the ECB has just enshrined in its policy framework. But one thing in fact you didn't mention much in your presentation is the price effects of greening policies. Energy prices are still quite sizable component of CPI, and more importantly, they play a prominent role in even disproportionate in terms of their weight on CPI in shaping households' inflation expectations. So can't you see a trade-off here between the urge to promote greening policies from the side of central banks up to the point of enshrining that in their mandates and their price stability, moderate inflation objectives? I would like to hear your views on that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting question and the interesting interventions from everybody. I don't consider the current energy prices crisis connected to the energy transition. I think this should be clear in the minds of all of us. This is a crisis that has to do with gas, and this is a crisis that it has to do with the fact that we have not transited away from fossil fuels and gas fast enough. Together with this, it is a crisis that has to do with disruptions that were created in the supply chain during the COVID. However, the green transition does not include gas. Natural gas is not a green fuel. It has a lower footprint than fossil fuel, but it's not green. The green transition uses wind energy, solar energy, geothermal energy, energy from waves, and it invests a lot of R&D in hydrogen. So the idea is for been released from energy pressures that are coming from countries outside Europe, at least, and also focus on the mixture of renewables that are really renewables and that are really green. So what the banks need to do is to reconceptualize their missions and include climate risk and environmental degradation risk. And if we are talking about the European, at the macro level, the European banks, I think that the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund can have the expertise and the scale to set the direction in deploying equity type financial instruments for complementary, which will be complementary to loans and guarantees. And with regards to inflation, if it was something that I expected. I am part of the Lancet Commission for COVID-19. I lead the Green Recovery Task Force. I am in the Financial Markets Task Force. And I was saying a major problem will be inflation. We have all these expansionary policies, and we are functioning on the assumption that there will be no inflation like it was in the previous many years, but the inflation came in, and the situation for the transition is much more difficult here. But the inflation does not have to do with the green transition. It has to do with other aspects, including the increase in natural gas, but we shouldn't be mixing the different things because the causality is not there, as far as I can see.
Thank you very much, Professor Koundouri. I have to quickly ask if there are any other remark or question from the audience. Yes.
My question goes to you, Marco Lombardi. You have mentioned in your presentation that higher inequality reduces the effectiveness of monetary policy. My first question is, can you elaborate a bit more on that? Why the transmission of monetary policy is affected at all by measures of inequality? The second question is, you have also mentioned that, well, after a crisis, we have an increase, typically an increase in inequality. To my understanding, so any crisis leads to an increase, a structural increase in inequality, because the less competitive sectors do not recover at all from a crisis. So my second question is, can we really fight a higher structural inequality by using monetary and fiscal policy? I do see, of course, the need to remedy a higher inequality, but can we really fight a structural result from a crisis?
Yeah, so thanks for the questions. Let me start from the second one. The remedy for a structural phenomenon is structural, is neither monetary nor fiscal. In the example you're giving, that perfectly fits. Every recession implies, depending on where the shock is coming from, then some sectors will need to restructure, and workers in such sectors will suffer because they will have to find a job somewhere else, right? So for this, you need retraining, you need policies that smoothly the process of moving from one sector to the other, and these are structural policies. I mean, to be sure, these are in the hands of government that also has the levers of the fiscal policy. What fiscal policy can do is to support the income while this retraining takes place. And it's important to acknowledge that these structural remedies, they're not immediate. It takes time to retrain people. And so you need some form of support in the meanwhile, not to let these people really sleep in poverty even more so than inequality. But definitely you're right. The remedies are structural and they need to be structural. And they need to tackle the roots of where inequality is coming from, be it retraining, education, health in some emerging economies, I'm thinking, or more generally, equal access of opportunities. That's what you should be aiming for. Now, on your second point, on your first question, in fact, on the transmission of monetary policy. So typically, the way we conceptualize the transmission of monetary policy to the real economy is through the effects that interest rates have on the consumption and investment decisions of households. So low rates means that you may want to borrow and buy durables, buy housing, and all sort of things that you may want to avail of because you have a lower cost of financing. Okay, so in a very unequal society, you have plenty of people that are at the very bottom of the income distribution and some few people on top, right? Those at the bottom are precisely those that are would be willing to avail of easy credit conditions to go and borrow and buy durables, buy cars, buy housing. But if they're so poor that they have no collateral to pledge to banks, or their source of income is too unstable and uncertain, that they're not going to get a loan from the bank, and the transmission mechanism would be impaired. On the other hand, you have these very rich people. They may well enjoy and benefit from low rates, but then their consumption level is already high. They have plenty of houses, and so why buy more? And that's the reason why we see that this mechanism could operate. And indeed, the empirical evidence I reported suggests that this is in fact taking place.
Thank you very much, Marco. I have to call the finish of our session now. Thank you to all panelists for their contributions. I think that all of us had very important elements to think about also after our meeting today. And we can close our second session and we can have our lunch break and start again at 3:00 p.m. I guess. Thank you very much, everybody.